tell the tale of 3 very eerie missing people cases that were never solved. Ruth Wilson was born on January 31st, 1971, in Betchworth, Surrey, in the UK. When Ruth was very young, her mother tragically took her own life. Her father, Ian, didn't want to change the way his daughter remembered her mother, so he told her that she had died in an accident. Despite this horrific incident in her early childhood, Ruth's life was pretty normal. Her father remarried, and she had several siblings. Ruth wasn't exactly a popular girl. She was nerdy, but she had her own group of tight-knit friends. She kept herself busy by earning good grades in school, babysitting, and working at a music shop, and serving as a volunteer at her church. She was known to be a sweet, intelligent girl. When Ruth was 16, she developed a hunch that what she had been told about her mother's death was a lie. She ended up opening up about this to one of her closest friends, Catherine Mayer. Ruth was so fixated on this hunch that she ended up running away briefly to London to view her mother's death certificate. At this point, Catherine began suspecting that something could be wrong with Ruth's home life. One of the last times that Ruth spent the night at Catherine's house, she expressed not wanting to go back home. Then, when Catherine announced that she was soon going to be moving back to Sheffield, Ruth told her she wanted to go with her. Unfortunately, she never got the chance. The weekend before Ruth's disappearance was pretty normal. She worked at her usual job and then got dinner with her ex-boyfriend, Will Kennedy, and one of their friends. At the end of the meal, she paid for everyone and cryptically said that it would give them something to remember her by. Will thought the statement was odd and didn't know what she meant by it. The following day, Ruth attended a church service, a youth group meeting, and then had dinner at Will's house. If there was something wrong, she gave no sign of it and appeared to be her normal, chipper self. The day that Ruth disappeared was Monday, November 27th, 1995. Her parents had left early for work, and she and her sister Jenny were getting ready for school. They were taking the bus there, but shortly before the bus was set to arrive, Ruth told Jenny she wouldn't be going. Jenny was surprised. It wasn't like her sister to skip school, and she waited until the very last minute to tell her. She assumed that Ruth would just show up at school later in the day. She boarded the bus, leaving her sister behind. She had no idea that that was the last time she would ever see her. After Jenny left, Will passed by and offered Ruth a ride to school, but she told him that she wouldn't be coming. He took this to mean that she would come after lunch, but she never ended up showing up. The first thing that Ruth did after Will left was call the florist and order a bouquet to be delivered for her stepmother. Strangely, she arranged for the flowers to be delivered the following Wednesday, not the same day. She then spent some time browsing the public library before taking a taxi to a local beauty spot right across from the pub, located on top of a hill. It was around 4:30 p.m. when she arrived. The taxi driver watched her from his rearview mirror and remembers her behavior seeming unusual. She didn't rush off anywhere or seem to have a plan of where she was going. She just stood silently in the wind and rain. The taxi driver wasn't the only person to notice Ruth's strange behavior. She caught the eye of a retired policeman named Liam McAuley. He noticed that she carried a small duffel bag and seemed to be prepared to be picked up by somebody else. When Ruth never returned home that night, her parents became worried and called the police. A missing persons report was filed, and it looked as if the 16-year-old had run away. The police driver who had dropped off Ruth provided what little information he had to the police, and the area where she had been dropped off was thoroughly searched. At first, there was no sign of her anywhere, but several days later, police found 3 notes hidden in the underbrush, not far from where she was last seen. The notes, speculated to be written by Ruth, were goodbye letters to her family and friends. Nearby them were empty packets of pain relievers and a half-empty bottle of alcohol. These items suggested that Ruth had committed suicide, but her body wasn't found anywhere in the nearby area, causing police to wonder if she purposefully planted them there. After Ruth's disappearance, Catherine noted that she thought there were things going on in her friend's personal life that may have contributed to her disappearance. She was unhappy, really unhappy. She cried with me about things. She didn't want to be there. Just why is unclear. She was not secretive about that. She didn't go into details, said Catherine. There was mass attention brought to Ruth's case, but to this day, she still remains missing. Police believe that there are several things that could have happened to her. She either took her own life, ran away on purpose, or was somehow abducted. Her passport and bank account were never touched. It's possible that Ruth is still out there somewhere and simply doesn't want to be found. Brittany Maitland was born on October 8, 1986, in Vermont. She was a determined and hardworking girl who yearned for her own independence. Despite not having any problems at home, she ended up moving out of her mother's house and moved in with a friend when she was just 17 years old. She wanted to try and make it on her own. Of course, this was not an easy task for a girl her age. It meant working 2 different jobs, one as a dishwasher and another as a waitress, just to make ends meet. Even while working so hard, Brittany still managed to complete her GED and had plans to attend a community college that coming fall. March 19, 2004 was the last day Brittany was ever seen. She was finishing up her dishwashing job at the Black Lantern Inn when her friends invited her to come out to a later dinner. She told them that she wouldn't be able to because she was going to have to wake up early the next day for her waitressing job. When she didn't come home that night, her roommate Jillian assumed that she had just gone home to visit with her mother and didn't suspect anything bad had taken place. But after 3 days passed and she still hadn't heard from Brittany, Jillian was starting to get worried. She ended up contacting Brittany's parents. Neither one of them had heard from her, and her mother filed a missing persons report. The first clue that police found tied to Brittany was her car. It had suffered some damage but was still in drivable condition and had been parked near an old barn. While Brittany was nowhere to be found, police did find a woman's fleece jacket, a broken necklace, and some loose change not far from her car. Inside the vehicle were more of the teen's personal items, including her driver's license, contact lenses, some medication, and some paychecks that she hadn't gotten a chance to cash yet. The fact that these items were left in the car caused police to suspect that she had not attempted to run away, but rather that foul play had been involved. As the news of Brittany's disappearance spread, a rumor was started that the girl had been abducted by 2 local drug dealers and was being kept against her will. The name of the dealers were Nathaniel Charles Jackson and Ramon Ryans. The police raided the homes of both of these men and arrested them for drug-related charges. While they admitted they knew of Brittany, neither man claimed to know anything about where she was. Because there was no sign of evidence that either man had anything to do with Brittany's disappearance, they were never charged in connection with the case. While Brittany's disappearance has gained a lot of attention and has even been discussed on crime documentaries, it is still not known what happened to the teenager that fateful night. If she is still alive somewhere out there today, she would be 36 years old. Out of all of the stories of unsolved missing persons cases, this one is the strangest and most disturbing. It is the case of the Sadistic Children. It was Christmas Eve in 1945, and George Sodden and his wife Jenny and their 9 children were asleep in their home in West Virginia. The children ranged from age 2 to 23 years old. At around 1 in the morning, a fire broke out within the house. Becoming aware of the fire, George and Jenny, as well as 4 of their children, were able to escape. However, 14-year-old Maurice, 12-year-old Martha, 9-year-old Louie, 8-year-old Jenny, and 5-year-old Betty remained in the house. These children shared 2 different rooms that were located upstairs. Desperate to save the other half of his family, George broke back into the house, only to find that the staircase was on fire and he couldn't get up to reach them. He went back outside in hopes of using his ladder to reach the children, but strangely, it was missing from its normal spot. To make matters even weirder, neither of the 2 vehicles George owned were starting, so he was unable to climb on top of them to reach the other level of the home. As all of this chaos was going on, Marion, one of the children that had escaped the fire, took matters into her own hands. She sprinted to a nearby neighbor and used their phone to call the fire department. She received no response. After hearing what was going on, a different neighbor tried to call for help on their phone, but also got no answer. Running out of options, that neighbor ended up driving into town and finding the fire chief, F.J. Morris, and alerted him of the situation. Despite the fact that the fire station was only around 2.5 miles from the Morris' home, the firefighters did not end up making it to the Sodder house until 8 a.m. that morning. By that point, it was of course far too late, and all that was left of the home was ashes. While authorities searched through the ash for any of the remains of the 5 children, nothing was found, and it was assumed that they all died in the fire. While it seemed strange that there were no signs whatsoever of the children's bodies, the fire chief said that the fire must have been so incredibly hot that it completely cremated every piece of their body. Still, things weren't adding up. There had been no scent of burning flesh, and there should have been at least some bone fragments left behind of the children. It was determined that bad wiring was the source of the fire, and the death certificates were issued for all 5 children. All that was left of the home was the basement. George ended up turning this into a memorial for all of the children he had lost. While he and his wife had initially believed that their children had all died and began to mourn their deaths, they began to become suspicious that there may be more to the story. It hadn't been long before the fire occurred that George had the wiring in the house checked by a professional, and it was determined to be working perfectly fine. As time went on, the couple began to believe that their children didn't, in fact, die in the fire, but rather were kidnapped. While this may sound like a pair of grieving parents clinging onto any last shred of hope, their suspicions may have very well been warranted. George was an Italian immigrant who started his family in Fayetteville, an area where a good amount of other Italian immigrants lived. George had a big presence in this community and wasn't afraid to talk publicly about his dislike of former Prime Minister and dictator Benito Mussolini. Some of the fellow Italian immigrants in the community didn't agree, which started some arguments and tension. Others in the community picked up on the fact that George never openly discussed why he had immigrated from Italy. It almost looked like he had been escaping something, which led some to believe he had enemies in Italy he was trying to get away from. It wasn't as if there wasn't strange occurrences leading up to the house fire that suggested something terrible was about to happen. The first of which was a visit at the home from an insurance salesman. When it became clear to the salesman that he wasn't going to be making the sale he wanted, he became furious and lashed out at George, telling him that his house would go up in smoke. Your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have made about Mussolini, the salesman told him. This wasn't the only strange event leading up to the house fire. Not long before the Sauter family house fire, 2 of the older Sauter children noticed a creepy man watching some of the younger children from afar as they made their way home from school. The last disturbing occurrence that took place was just around 30 minutes before the fire occurred. Even though it was the middle of the night, the phone rang, waking up Jenny. She got out of bed to answer it, and she heard a woman's unfamiliar voice on the other line, accompanied by laughter and clinking glasses. She assumed someone had just dialed the wrong number and made her way back to bed. As she did this, she noticed the lights downstairs were still on. She figured that some of her children, excited because of the Christmas holiday, had just decided to stay up a little later. She dismissed this and slowly began to fall back asleep. Now, why is the lights being on downstairs being considered a strange circumstance regarding this case? The answer is actually quite simple. If there had been a malfunction with the wiring within the home, as the fire chief had suggested, no lights in the house would have been working during this time. Not much time had passed since Jenny noticed the downstairs light before she suddenly heard a loud bang upstairs, accompanied by the smell of smoke entering her bedroom. It was then that she woke up her husband and escaped the home with half of her family. The more time that passed since the horrific house fire, the more Jenny began to believe that what she had been told happened to her children was a lie. She began doing her own investigations, which involved burning animal bones. Each time she tried it, there was still bone fragments left behind. On top of this, some of the living children found pieces of old appliances left in the rubble of their home. This furthered Jenny's suspicions that if her children had really died in the fire, there should have been bone fragments left behind. As if things weren't already confusing enough, people began to come forward and claim they had seen the missing children. One person claimed to have seen the children in a car while the fire was still going on, while another person claimed to have served the children breakfast at a restaurant the next morning. Not long after these sightings did another person claim to see the children walking with 2 men of Italian descent. While she tried to interact with the children, the men quickly scared her off, not allowing her to say anything more. Jenny and George remained convinced that their children had been kidnapped. Their next clue occurred several years later when George was flipping through a New York newspaper and saw a photo of a girl he believed to be his missing daughter, Betty. Desperate to reunite with his young daughter, George drove all the way to New York, only to be told by the child's parents that they had no interest in meeting with him. Of course, he was devastated, but not willing to give up yet. Several years after the fire, George and Jenny reached out to the FBI for help. While the FBI was willing to assist them, strangely, both the Fayetteville Police Department and Fire Department said that they wouldn't help them. There was clearly something shady going on, so George reached out to a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley in hopes of getting to the bottom of it. Tinsley wasted no time in digging up an interesting clue. He determined that one of the people on the coroner's jury that had confirmed that the Sauter House fire was an accident was the same life insurance salesman that had threatened George earlier on. On top of that, there was a rumor going around town that the fire chief had said that he had actually found a human heart in the remnants of the burnt down home. Instead of telling George, he had hidden it in a box and buried it where the home once stood. Tinsley searched for the box, and while he did find it, it contained beef liver, not a human heart. The only explanation the fire chief could give for doing this was that he wanted to provide George and Jenny with a sense of closure. Next, George hired a pathologist to study the debris left from the fire. For the first time, the pathologist was able to find some bone shards. There was pieces of a vertebrae that looked as if they belonged to someone between 16 and 17 years old. This is where things get even weirder. The oldest person that had supposedly perished in the fire was a 14-year-old boy, so it was unlikely that the bones belonged to him. To make things even stranger, the bone fragments had never been exposed to a fire. So who did they belong to? Unfortunately, the answer was never found. The state governor closed the case, telling the grieving parents that their search for their children was hopeless. George and Jenny would later put up a billboard in hopes of someone being able to provide them with information regarding their children's whereabouts. The billboard stayed up for 40 years. But sadly, the parents were never reunited with their children. To this day, many people, especially those who are from the area of Fayetteville, believe that the mafia were involved with the children's disappearance and that the children went on to live their lives under new identities.